As an emblem of Salisbury citizens' ability to mark their high days and holidays, the Salisbury Giant is probably the most impressive. Now in retirement at Salisbury and South Wiltshire Museum, the Giant, otherwise known as St Christopher, and his compatriot Hobnob were often seen being paraded in the streets during special occasions. Over the years, his dramatic appearances have been caught on camera by many of our amateur filmmakers, along with those responsible for taking the Giant and Hobnob out onto the streets. People like former museum curator Peter Saunders.
I first made his acquaintance when I came to Salisbury in 1970 as a very junior assistant curator. And one of my first jobs was to remove the cobwebs from the shoulder and around the head. As you can imagine, sort of keeping him spick and span was quite something. But over the years, I've moved him around, looked into his history, introduced him to scholars and students researching the tradition of the Giant, right through really to 1977, which was his last outing. And it was in that year that we took him into the Market Square to celebrate the Queen's Silver Jubilee. And I had somewhat dubious pleasure. It would be frowned on today, I think, for a museum curator to do this. But back in 1977, I provided the legs, if I can put it that way, for Hobnob to cavort in front of the Giant. The first record of him dates back to 1570. It was recorded that one of the members of the Guild of Tailors, of whom he was the symbol, if you like, the pageant figure of the tailors, it was recorded that he was brought out and repaired, so he obviously existed earlier than that. This piece of glass is particularly interesting because it comes from the original guild hall of the Tailors' Guild, and it depicts the Giant here as St Christopher with his staff carrying the infant Jesus across a river. And this, of course, makes the connection between St Christopher and the Giant. And this, of course, is why the Salisbury Giant is known here as St Christopher. If you look around the country, there are obviously many traditions, Helston, Norwich, Chester, places like that, like Salisbury indeed, had their own traditions. Here in Salisbury it was very much connected to those saints' days, John the Baptist, St George and so forth. Well, my friend Hobnob here is obviously a hobby horse. His role really was to make way for the Giant. As the Giant was going along in a procession down the streets of Salisbury, he would snap, and if you look closely you can see that the man inside the Hobnob here would be manipulating the jaws of the Hobnob as he ran along, snapping away, frightening the little boys to make way for the Giant. But of course, remember, he was also accompanied by the whifflers carrying the Giant's sword and the mace, which themselves are rather vicious weapons, and although used in part, I think, to support the Giant, were nevertheless used to keep the public away from the Giant. So the Hobnob really shared that duty with the whifflers. And he's really a character, a really nice character, I think, and much loved in Salisbury. Even his hair is actually made from original horse hair and leather, of course. When you get in, you can come up underneath and your head is protected by the netting, and the feet that just appear out of the bottom were, in 1977 at least, my own feet. It was a little bit claustrophobic. One was never quite sure where the next rotten apple or egg was going to come flying from. But I'm pleased to say that at least the people of Salisbury in 1977 were fairly well behaved. But thinking back as to what it must have been like in medieval times when people had much less respect, I think, one can imagine returning home at the end of the day, mud splattered, really exhausted. It's not that he's so heavy to carry. It's just that you've got to be the centre of fun and attention. And it is a very serious duty, you know, making way for Salisbury's very own Giant.